I'd like to introduce you to your nervous system, or to the nervous system that you have that you may not understand fully. First of all, we have our brain and our spinal cord. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the qualities of both of these in just a minute. You also have the peripheral nervous system, the nerves that come out of your spinal cord. And those nerves are divided into two groups, your sympathetic nerves and your parasympathetic nerves. While your nerves may look the same, they have entirely different functions. So let's come back to your brain for just a minute. Your brain is divided into various parts, and I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about your reptilian brainstem, which is right in here. And yes, it's called the reptilian brainstem because we have it in common with reptiles. You also have your mammalian brain, and this has a different function than your reptilian brainstem. You also have your prefrontal cortex, and in your left hemisphere of your brain, that contains your capacity for language. So let's keep in mind as we move through the rest of this diagram that your capacity for language and conscious thought sits in a very small part of your brain and a very small part of your nervous system. Let's talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. It used to be perceived that the autonomic nervous system was automatic and that it didn't need any input from you to run it, and that it ran just fine all on its own. I'd like to just discuss this idea with you. Autonomic does not mean automatic. I used to be a pilot, and although many aircraft had automatic pilots on them, the pilot was in charge of flying the airplane, no matter what. If anything happened, the automatic pilot was not blamed, but the pilot was blamed for whatever had gone wrong. So just because you have an automatic pilot does not mean that you rely solely on it and give your power over to it. Your autonomic nervous system does require your input and your monitoring so that it functions at the highest level possible. A lot of your automatic functions are contained in other parts of the brain. You don't have to think to breathe. You don't have to think to swallow. There are many functions that happen all the time without your having to think about them. Let's explore your nervous system in a whole new way. Your sympathetic nervous system, or the yellow nerves, is your fight or flight. Sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze. Parasympathetic is the green nerves, and that's your relaxation response. And if you look, green nerves come out of your sacral area of your spine and up here in the upper part of your spinal column. And if you look, there's lots of yellow nerves that come out of the spine. And this is because you are wired to survive. That's one of your primary functions of your nervous system. If we look over the activity that occurs when you're in sympathetic nervous system activity, where the yellow nerves come into various glands and organs, and your skin and cells and other places, you will see that the sympathetic nervous system is designed to shut down. These nerves come into the back part of the eye, and they change the colors and the cones and the rods that the eye perceives. And, quite literally, your pupil shifts so that you lose your peripheral vision. And this is a function of survival. Your body wants to find the threat, so it limits your vision and your hearing and some of your other functions so that you can hear the saber-toothed tiger or the woolly mammoth coming out at you, and you survive. What begins to happen as well is that you lose your sense of peripheral vision, and on an emotional level, you might feel as if you have no choices. So in your sympathetic nervous system, with your vision narrowed and your hearing narrowed down so that you just get to hear the whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of an oncoming threat, you begin to feel hopeless and helpless and as if there are no choices. There are some styles of music that can move you into sympathetic activity, and they're designed to keep you there. Interesting, yes? The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, comes into the eye in different places, and the parasympathetic nervous system opens up your vision. You see colors and shapes, and you get to see what's happening with a broad vision. In sympathetic, you're focused on the next task or the next step to take, with no sense of a large vision. In parasympathetic, you get a really good idea of what a vision is and what steps you need to take to achieve that vision. Your brain is working in harmony and in cooperation with all of mind-body. Your left hemisphere of the brain, as mentioned before, is your language hemisphere, and it holds all your language and linear concepts and logical thinking. Your right hemisphere thinks in colors and shapes and symbols. And when the left and the right hemispheres of your brain are not communicating, your conversation becomes pretty one-sided and pretty lacking in a full sense of cooperation. The left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body, and in a more holistic approach, it is viewed as the masculine brain. Your right hemisphere is viewed as the more feminine brain, and it controls the left side of your body. Coming back to this diagram, you'll see that in your salivary gland, your sympathetic nervous system innervates one part of your gland and your tongue and your nose and your palate. And your tongue is actually designed to taste 4 flavors: bitter, sweet, sour, and salt. If you're eating on the run, or you're eating fast, or you're eating while you're flighting, you only taste the salt. Well, the fast food restaurants have capitalized on this, and they highly salt their food, knowing that if you're eating on the run or while you're driving, you're really not tasting your food. All you're tasting is the salt, which is pretty much what you're capable of. The salivary gland here is a nice organ for us to look at because you can see the sympathetic axis comes in at the beginning of the gland. This is to shut it off so you don't produce the saliva that you need to start the nourishment process. Because let's face it, if you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, stopping and having a fine dining experience isn't high on your list. So your salivary gland shuts down. In the parasympathetic, you can see that you have more nerve access in the larger part of the salivary gland body, and this is to help you produce lots of saliva. Actually, the digestion process begins in your eye. If you're not seeing the colors of the food, if you're not smelling how wonderful they smell, and you're not tasting them, getting nourishment from your food is a challenging thing to do. Let's move down to your heart. You'll notice that the sympathetic nerves come into the small muscles of your heart, causing it to beat faster and more inefficiently. It works harder to move a lower volume of blood and thus have high blood pressure because your heart is beating so quickly. The parasympathetic nerves come into the larger muscles of your heart, and they make its heartbeat much more efficient. You're using the larger muscles that are designed to pump the blood throughout your body. Also, when you are in a high sympathetic state, you can move into a condition called shock. And shock is a life-threatening condition. What happens when you get highly sympathetic is the blood leaves your core, starting with your brain and that prefrontal cortex that has your higher order thinking in it. It flows out your core and into your arms and your legs so that you can fight or flight. And if the stress is hard enough and intense enough, you may actually freeze, like the deer in the headlights. After some time, the core of your body begins to say, I need some of that blood back. So it calls it back in, and now you have a large volume of blood flowing back into your heart, causing your heart to work even harder. But if the perception is that the threat is still there, the blood will soon leave your core and go out to your arms and legs. This can cause a disruption in any number of systems, such as maintaining an appropriate body temperature, or a good pH, or digesting your food, or any other functions that need the sympathetic activity to go away or abate, and parasympathetic activity to come in and be a part of what's happening. Another important aspect to know is that when you are breathing, your sympathetic nerves go into your upper part of your lungs, and your parasympathetic nerves go into the lower part. Also, please be aware that your diaphragm, which is your breathing muscle, sits below your lungs. If the diaphragm contracts down, your lungs fill with air all the way down to the lower part of the lungs. And the highest concentration of the capillaries, or the blood vessels, that get oxygen into your blood are in the lower part of your lungs. Then when you breathe out and your diaphragm pushes up, it causes the air to leave all the way out through your lungs, and that way you can exchange it for air that has lots of oxygen, and you have lots of oxygen flowing throughout your body, brain, and muscles, and everywhere it's needed. Also, the esophagus for your stomach moves through your diaphragm. And if you're not using your diaphragm for breathing, that esophagus can get closed down, the food doesn't move through it, and you can easily have a condition called acid reflux. And acid reflux is simply the sympathetic nervous system keeping the stomach from taking the food in and digesting it appropriately. And look at the parasympathetic axis. It comes to the larger parts of your stomach muscles and allows your stomach to do the work that it needs to do to digest your food. I could talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic axis for each of your glands and organs, that the sympathetic is designed to shut down and the parasympathetic is designed to open up. However, I would like for you to just notice one thing here, and this is probably one of the more important points of what I'm discussing. If you'll notice, your adrenal gland has no parasympathetic axis, but it is highly accessed by your sympathetic nervous system. So the adrenal gland responds to a lot of your sympathetic nervous system signals, and the only way to get this adrenal gland to calm down is to create a whole body, mind-body, body-mind environment of parasympathetic peace and calming and healing. When you have a whole mind-body environment of peace and calming and healing, your adrenal gland will calm down and stop producing so much adrenaline. Now, we've talked about a balanced life being 12 hours in the sympathetic and 12 hours in the parasympathetic. If you've been more sympathetic and highly weighted into sympathetic, sometimes it takes a while for you to come into balance. But if you're right in the center, because you can't be in both at the same time, your movement either into sympathetic or parasympathetic is pretty minimal, and you gotta get to stay the course. However, if you're highly sympathetic or you're highly parasympathetic, it's hard to come back into that middle, into that being balanced. Also, being centered is living in the present moment, where the activity of the past and future is available to you, but your thought process, your ability to be in the present moment, comes right down the center of your body. So if you're balanced and centered, you are in a very healthy place to be. Let's talk about a few more qualities of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. As mentioned before, your sympathetic nervous system is fight, flight, or freeze. Your parasympathetic is relaxation, restoration, and healing. When you're in the sympathetic, you feel as if you have no choices, and your options are very limited, and you try very hard to maintain control, which is an illusion, because in reality you have very little control. In the parasympathetic, you have choices, and you get to see the big vision and the big picture, and you understand that there's a small piece that you control that then becomes a part of the whole picture. You are in protection in the sympathetic, and you are in growth in the parasympathetic. The emotion of the sympathetic is fear, and the emotion of the parasympathetic is love. The energetic flow of the sympathetic is stuck, frozen, non-moving. The energetic of the parasympathetic nervous system is flow, movement, and a continual source of life is good. Remember that you cannot be in both of these systems at the same time. So make your plans accordingly, get balanced, get centered, and know that you're doing a very healthy thing for the whole of who you are, for the whole of mind-body and body-mind. Thank you for your attention.